The rain fell softly over the rolling hills of Derbyshire as Oliver Hughes stepped off the bus. He carried only a worn leather satchel and a notebook filled with questions. Before him stretched the quiet village of Bracken Hollow, with its crooked stone cottages, narrow lanes, and the shadow of the abandoned mine looming beyond the hills. The mine had been closed for more than 50 years, after a cave-in buried dozens of workers alive. Official records called it a tragedy. Villagers called it a curse. Oliver had read enough old articles to sense that something about the disaster did not add up. He was determined to uncover the truth. At the edge of the village square stood the Hollow Arms, a small inn with faded curtains and a warm fire flickering through the windows. Oliver entered and was greeted by the innkeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, a stout woman with sharp eyes. "You'll be here about the mine, I reckon," she said, without waiting for him to introduce himself. Her tone was not curious but wary, almost warning. Oliver gave a polite smile. "I'm writing a piece on the history of Bracken Hollow. I thought the mine would make an important part of it." Mrs. Fletcher's lips tightened. She handed him the brass key without another word. The silence weighed heavily, as though he had touched on something forbidden. Later that evening, Oliver sat by the inn's window, his notebook open. Outside, mist crept over the cobbled streets, and beyond it, he could just make out the silhouette of the mine's entrance. As he stared, a movement caught his eye. A lone figure stood near the old road that led to the hills. It was still, watching, as though waiting for him. And then, without a sound, it disappeared into the fog. The next morning, Oliver decided to spend some time at the village pub, the Black Stag, where the miners of old once gathered. It was a low-ceilinged place, with wooden beams blackened by age and the faint smell of coal smoke lingering in the air. A few villagers sat hunched over their pints, their conversations falling silent the moment he stepped in. Oliver ordered a tea and settled quietly in the corner. Soon enough, the murmurs began again, though they carried a different tone, hushed, cautious, as if he were not meant to hear. Snatches of words reached him: "The mine, outsiders, best leave it alone." One of the older men, his face weathered like the hills, finally turned towards Oliver. His grey eyes were hard. "You're digging in places best left buried, lad," the man said. His voice was gravelly, and it carried more weight than the others. 50 years have passed. Let the dead rest. Oliver leaned forward. "But don't you want the truth? There are records missing, names that never appeared in the reports. Someone covered something up." The man's hand tightened on his glass. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he rose, pushing back his chair with a scrape. As he passed Oliver's table, he bent low enough for only Oliver to hear. "Stay away from that mine. You're being watched." The words hung in the air like smoke. By the time Oliver turned, the man had gone, leaving only a half-empty pint and the faint echo of his warning. Later, walking back through the square, Oliver could not shake the feeling of eyes on him. He glanced up toward the ridge where the mine lay hidden in mist. A shape moved there, dark against the pale morning sky, tall, still, and waiting. This time, it did not disappear. That night, the inn felt colder than before. The fire burned low in the hearth, but the chill seemed to come from the very stones of the building. Oliver sat at the desk in his room, sorting through the notes he had gathered. His mind replayed the words of the old man in the pub: "You're being watched." Unable to sleep, Oliver wandered into the narrow corridor. At the far end stood a small cabinet, its door slightly ajar. Something about it caught his attention. He pulled it open and discovered a bundle of old belongings wrapped in a faded cloth. Among them lay a leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. Inside were pages written in hurried handwriting. The name on the first page made Oliver's heart quicken: Thomas Whitlow, one of the miners officially listed as dead in the collapse. Yet the entries continued days after the supposed accident. "They told us to keep quiet. Not an accident. Men trapped alive. But the orders came from above. No rescue. No word must leave Bracken Hollow. Oliver's hands trembled as he read. It was not merely a collapse. It was a cover-up. Lives had been abandoned deliberately. Just then, a floorboard creaked outside his door. Oliver froze, clutching the journal to his chest. Shadows shifted beneath the doorframe, blocking the thin strip of light from the hallway. Someone was standing there. Minutes dragged like hours, until the shadow finally moved away. Oliver rushed to the window, but when he looked out onto the misty street below, a figure was already vanishing into the fog, tall, dark, and silent. The following day broke with a pale sun, though the mist clung stubbornly to the fields. Oliver had scarcely slept, his thoughts consumed by the journal. If the entries were true, then the mine was more than a site of tragedy, it was the scene of something unspeakable. Driven by restless determination, he set out towards the hills. The path wound past hedgerows and stunted trees, the ground soft beneath his boots. The air grew colder with each step, as though the land itself carried the memory of what had happened there. At last, the gaping mouth of the mine appeared, a black wound in the hillside, its timbers rotting, its stones damp with decades of silence. The entrance was half blocked by fallen beams, yet a narrow gap remained, just wide enough for a man to slip through. Oliver hesitated. The warnings echoed in his mind, but the journal seemed to pull him closer, as if the voices of the trapped miners were urging him on. He lit the small torch he carried, the beam trembling against the stone walls. Inside, the air was heavy with damp earth and rust. Broken tracks still ran along the floor, disappearing into the shadows. Every sound was magnified, the drip of water, the scurry of unseen creatures, the crunch of his boots on gravel. Deeper he went, until he reached a collapsed passage. There, scratched faintly into the stone, were words barely visible in the torchlight. His heart lurched as he read them. "We are still here." Before he could take another breath, a sound rose behind him, slow, deliberate footsteps echoing in the darkness, though he knew he had entered the mine alone. Oliver spun around, his torchlight cutting through the blackness. The tunnel was empty, only rough stone walls and the damp earth beneath his feet. Yet the sound of footsteps had been real, measured, heavy, too deliberate to be imagination. He tightened his grip on the journal, heart pounding in his chest. Slowly, he backed towards the collapsed passage. Then the beam of his torch caught something in the dust near the wall. A boot print, fresh, pressed sharply into the dirt. He was not alone. The air grew colder, his breath misting in the torchlight. A low whisper seemed to drift through the mine, carrying words he could not understand, fading before he could grasp them. He turned sharply, the light sweeping across a timber beam. And there, half hidden in the gloom, stood a figure. The man was tall, his face obscured by the shadow of his cap. His clothes were rough, old-fashioned, like those of the miners from long ago. For a moment Oliver's mind reeled, was this one of them, still wandering the dark tunnels? But then the figure moved, stepping forward with purposeful calm. The glint of metal caught Oliver's eye, a lantern, burning faintly, though no flame should have survived in this place. Oliver raised his voice, though it trembled. "Who are you?" The man did not answer. Instead, he turned and began walking deeper into the mine, his lantern casting a pale circle ahead of him. He did not look back, but it was clear, Oliver was meant to follow. And against all reason, Oliver did. The air grew thicker the deeper Oliver followed. The narrow tunnels opened into a wider chamber, its walls glistening with damp stone. The stranger's lantern burned faintly ahead, guiding the way. Oliver's torch shook in his hand, though he dared not let the light falter. At the center of the chamber lay rusted tools, abandoned helmets, and fragments of wood long rotted. Yet among the decay, something more chilling stood out, a row of wooden supports, nailed into the rock like a crude barrier. Upon them, scratched deep into the grain, were names. Dozens of names. Oliver stepped closer, his throat tightening. He recognized some from the journal, men who had supposedly perished in the collapse. But the dates carved beneath told a different story. They had lived for days after the accident, trapped in the dark, waiting for a rescue that never came. The tall man placed his lantern down by the wall. The dim glow illuminated his face for the first time. His features were gaunt, hollow-eyed, his skin grey with the pallor of someone who had never seen the sun. Oliver felt a chill pierce his bones. This was no living man. Yet before Oliver could move, the figure raised a hand and pointed towards the barrier of names. The gesture was urgent, insistent. Oliver's torch swept over the wall again, and then he saw it. Among the carved names, fresher than the rest, was another word. One that had no place among the dead. Fletcher. The innkeeper's name. A rush of footsteps sounded in the tunnel behind him, louder this time, real, closing in fast. Oliver spun around, clutching the journal as the chamber filled with echoes. Someone was coming, and whoever it was did not want him to leave alive. Oliver's pulse thundered in his ears as the footsteps closed in. He darted behind a stack of broken timbers, pressing himself against the damp stone wall. The chamber was no longer silent. It vibrated with the heavy tread of boots, purposeful and hunting. The beam of another torch pierced the darkness, sweeping across the chamber. It paused on the carved names, lingered, then shifted, searching. Oliver held his breath, clutching the journal so tightly his knuckles ached. A familiar voice cut through the gloom. "You should have left it alone. Mrs. Fletcher." Her tone was colder than the mist outside, stripped of the warmth she showed to her guests. She stepped into view, the torchlight revealing her face twisted with something harder than anger, fear, perhaps, or desperation. "You don't understand what you've walked into," she hissed. "Those men were meant to be forgotten. If the truth comes out, this village will never recover." Oliver's voice was hoarse but steady. "They were abandoned. You knew. Your family was part of it." The torchlight wavered as Mrs. Fletcher's hand trembled, but her jaw set firm. "Some debts never die, Mr. Hughes. And some secrets must stay buried, even if it means burying you with them." With that, she raised something in her free hand, a length of iron, rusted but deadly in the dim glow. She stepped forward, her shadow stretching long across the chamber. Oliver backed towards the barrier of names. Behind him, the ghostly figure of the miner still stood, lantern burning faintly, watching. For a moment, Oliver thought he saw the slightest nod, urging him to act. But Mrs. Fletcher was already closing the distance, her weapon lifted high. Mrs. Fletcher's shadow loomed large as she raised the iron bar, her eyes glinting with desperate resolve. Oliver's back pressed against the wall of names, his fingers brushing the rough carvings. The ghostly miner still lingered in the chamber, his lantern glowing with an otherworldly light. With a sudden cry, Mrs. Fletcher swung the iron. Oliver ducked, the bar striking the wall with a thunderous crack. Splinters flew, dust filling the air. The ground trembled, stones shifting above them. "Stop this!" Oliver shouted. "You're only proving the guilt your family carried." Her face twisted, rage overtaking fear. Better guilt than ruin. The mine must remain silent. She raised the iron again, but before she could bring it down, the ghostly miner stepped forward. His lantern flared, bathing the chamber in a harsh, unnatural glow. For the first time, Mrs. Fletcher faltered. Her eyes widened, her grip slackening as the figure advanced. The sound of many voices rose from the darkness, low, mournful, unending. The voices of the abandoned. The chamber shuddered violently. Rocks fell from the ceiling, beams groaned. Oliver seized the moment, lunging for the journal as Mrs. Fletcher stumbled back. Her torch fell, clattering across the stones. A beam crashed down between them, cutting her off from Oliver. Dust and debris filled the air as the walls cracked, splitting the chamber apart. Through the haze, Oliver saw Mrs. Fletcher one last time, her face pale with terror, before the ceiling gave way. The lantern's glow guided Oliver towards a narrow gap in the rocks. Crawling, choking on dust, he dragged himself out just as the tunnel collapsed behind him with a roar that shook the hills. When he stumbled into the pale daylight, coughing, bruised, the mine entrance was gone, sealed forever beneath tons of stone. But in his hands, the journal remained. The names carved into the wood, the truth of the forgotten men, could no longer be buried. And as Oliver looked back at the hillside, a faint light flickered once more within the rubble, one last flare of the miner's lantern, before fading into silence.